The youngest and fifth wife of Henry VIII, Katherine Howard was also arguably the most tragic. Too young to really understand what she was getting herself into, too few people in her corner, and either too silly or naive, Katherine would end up being queen for only a little longer than Anne of Cleves, and with a far worse ending. Katherine did not have a great start in life despite her noble ancestry. Her aunt was Elizabeth Howard, mother to Anne Boleyn, making Katherine Anne's cousin, but also a cousin once removed of Elizabeth I. And she was the second cousin to Jane Seymour through her grandmother Elizabeth Tilney. She was also the granddaughter of Thomas Howard, 2nd Duke of Norfolk, who had distinguished himself under 4 kings, but her father was merely Thomas's 3rd son, Lord Edmund Howard. The 3rd son in any noble family was doomed to find his own way in the world rather than inheriting, but Edmund also had no head for business and loved gambling and spending money he didn't have. Katherine's mother Joyce was a daughter of a minor noble, Sir Richard Culpeper, and before her marriage to Edmund had already been married to Ralph Lee, the younger brother of her stepfather, and had 5 children with him. Yes, it is a confusing family tree. After being widowed and remarrying Edmund, Joyce then went on to have a further 6 children, with Katherine being roughly the 8th child of her mother. Although Katherine's birth date is far from certain, she was probably born sometime between 1521 and 1523 in Lambeth. This date has been figured out by a combination of wills from other family members, knowledge of Katherine and her siblings in terms of the order they were born in, and the ages of her later ladies-in-waiting when she became queen. With such a large family to provide for, and the fact Edmund was fairly useless at making a living, it meant he often had to rely on wealthier relatives for help. Katherine, along with so many of her other siblings, especially her sisters, was likely a very unwanted child. A son could help the family one day. A daughter was a drain and needed a dowry providing in order to marry her off and make her someone else's financial burden. As a result, Katherine was a neglected child from the start, and it's highly unlikely any education was ever bothered with for her in her early years. When Joyce died a few years after Katherine's birth in 1528, it sent the family even more into her father's debt, despite him marrying 2 more times after Joyce's death. But in 1531, a glimmer of hope came when Anne Boleyn was the girlfriend and soon-to-be wife of Henry VIII. Edmund wrote to Anne and asked for help in gaining funds, and was given the position of Comptroller of Calais, a lucrative position, but it meant going to Calais. He had no choice but to leave behind his large family, and the children were broken up from one another. Dowries were found for 2 of her elder half-sisters, allowing them to be married off, but Katherine was sent with her probably elder brother Henry to be wards of Agnes Howard, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. Agnes was the 2nd wife of their grandfather Thomas Howard and was a favourite at court even after his death in 1522. Sounds perfect, right? Except it wasn't. While Agnes was seen as a safe pair of hands, she was actually often at court and had little direct involvement with the raising of her wards. And she had a lot more wards than just Katherine and Henry, with several from the Howard family she had married into and several from her own Tilney family. They were divided between her 2 households at Chesworth House in Horsham, Sussex, and at Norfolk House in Lambeth. And due to Agnes being absent for long periods of time, supervision was less than ideal. Katherine ended up at Chesworth House, and while her time there seems to have started off well, it would take a turn for the uncomfortable around 1536. It was around this time that Katherine's limited education was expanded upon, and she began music lessons with 2 teachers. One of these was a young man named Henry Manox, who was likely in his early to mid-20s, and Catherine was in her early teens. The two began a highly inappropriate relationship which would last until around 1538. There is a lot of debate over the exact nature of their relationship. Due to differing attitudes at the time, there are some arguments that this was simply two young people fancying the pants off each other and taking a big risk. Then there are other arguments that due to Catherine's young age, this was at best a young man taking advantage of a naive young woman, and at worst, grooming. It's certainly true that Catherine really had no one in her corner to give her any advice at all about life, least of all about sex and romance. This should have been the job of Agnes Howard, but in her absence, this didn't happen. When the pair would be questioned years later, both Catherine and Henry admitted they engaged in sexual touching, but it never went so far as coitus. Henry seems to have put pressure on Catherine to have sex with him, and he often gossiped about their relationship with the household servants. Two things which made her break off contact with Manox in the spring of 1538. But sadly, this wouldn't be the only sticky relationship Catherine would find herself in. A secretary of Agnes, Frances Derham, was taken with Catherine and pursued her shortly after she broke off contact with Manox. Allegedly, this did go further than Catherine's previous liaisons, and the pair became lovers. But they also began to call one another husband and wife in front of others in the household, and Frances even allowed Catherine to take on some wifely duties for him, such as taking care of some of his savings when he was sent away to Ireland, and it was even possible they had exchanged some kind of vows with each other before having sex. This was very important for any future marriage for Catherine, as in the eyes of the church, she would already be married. However, on one of Agnes's rare visits to Sussex, she found out about the affair and put an end to it in 1539. In order to distance the pair and also to further the ambitions of the Howard family, a place was found for Catherine at court by her uncle Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk. At this point, the relationship between Catherine and Henry was nothing to write home about. When she arrived at court, he obviously found her attractive and they flirted together whenever they met. But this was the story for many women at court. By 1540, she was put into the household of the new Queen, Anne of Cleves, as a maid of honour. Henry's flirting with Catherine only grew as his interest in Anne waned quickly. Anne had rejected him, most likely, when he surprised her upon her arrival in England, and her reaction of disgust at an older, unknown man with a bad-smelling leg had been too real for him. Catherine wasn't as sharp, smart, or manipulative as previous women in Henry's life had been, but she did understand men and how to flatter them. She pretended not to notice Henry's bad leg, which often oozed pus, needed to be cleaned every day with fresh bandages, and smelled horrendous. She allowed Henry to feel he was once again the young, slender, athletic youth he had once been, who had picked up women by the score, despite the massive evidence to the contrary. It is often at this point that Catherine is shown as a good-time girl, but actually this is more like the story of an abused young girl. Agnes had no interest in her step-granddaughter, and it's clear the Duke of Norfolk saw her as little else than a tool to further his own power and prestige with the king. Although Henry was decades older than she was and could hardly offer her the same romantic relationship as a man closer to her own age, it's highly likely that the attention the king showed Catherine made up somewhat for the lack of affection and parental care she had received in her childhood. Or, as we might say today, poor Catherine probably had daddy and mummy issues. Anne of Cleves was a clever woman, and when she realised an affair was probably blossoming between Catherine and Henry, she certainly didn't care on an emotional level, as she did not care for Henry herself. However, it's likely she feared for what the king might do to remove her from the picture, knowing how his previous wives had gone out. Although it had not been absolutely confirmed publicly, it was common knowledge at the court that Henry and Anne had not consummated their marriage, making the alliance a shaky one. And with few friends in Europe due to his breaking away from the Catholic Church, Henry really needed to maintain his alliance with Anne's Protestant brother, Duke William of Cleves. But by the 24th of June, Henry had had enough of apparently not fancying his wife, even though it was likely the other way around, and Anne was sent from London to Richmond on the pretext of plague being present in the city. This was, of course, nonsense, as hypochondriac Henry would also have left if there had been a whiff of anyone even coughing. But it was enough to send his lawful wife away while he met up with Catherine. She had been placed in the palace at Lambeth, and Henry was spotted on several occasions being rowed in a small boat to visit her. Bishop Gardiner also entertained both Henry and Catherine at banquets held at his palace at Southwark. It's safe to say that by July 1540, the affair between the king and Catherine was public knowledge. Completely unaware that their kinswoman already had carnal knowledge of men, Catherine was warned to maintain her pure and honest condition, while also making it very clear to Henry that she would happily sleep with him once he put a ring on it. As for the king, his lust for Catherine and his ego allowed him to believe he was both passionately in love with Catherine and that it was reciprocated, and blinded him to the Howard family's obvious manipulation. However, aside from her earlier dalliances before Henry, Catherine was already involved with someone else. On her arrival at court, before the king took a real interest in her, she had been spotted by Thomas Culpeper, a member of Henry's court. He had worked for Viscount Lisle, who was an uncle of Henry VIII, helping the Viscount to obtain items for the court, including a hawk for the king himself. It wasn't long before Culpeper, who was described as a beautiful youth, charming and knew how to make himself indispensable, soon became a favourite of Henry's. He had some influence over the king, and was often bribed to speak for others in their favour. Eventually, he was created Keeper of the Armoury, working his way up to being given the position of Gentleman of the Privy Chamber. Henry had also given Culpeper several properties by the time Catherine arrived at court. The two had flirted with each other, and it seems Culpeper had assumed their relationship would turn sexual, but Catherine turned him down. He moved on to another woman in the royal household, and Catherine was distraught, publicly bursting into tears in front of her fellow maids of honour. When Francis Derham heard about rumours of their marriage, he wrote to confront them both, only to be ignored by Catherine. So although she was technically single and free to marry Henry, her personal life was murky by 16th century standards. Henry had lavished gifts of property, jewels and expensive cloth on Catherine since the beginning of 1540, and it was clear he was completely besotted with her, calling her his very jewel of womanhood. The marriage of Anne and Henry was calmly annulled on the 12th of July, Anne very shrewdly realising she could have her cake and eat it, as she was given lands, a generous annuity, and a whole bunch of other prizes for not making a fuss. And she was able to remain in England and avoid another marriage of her brother's choosing. This left the king free to marry again, and on the day Thomas Cromwell was executed for apparently messing up his chances by suggesting Anne in the first place, on the 28th of July, Catherine and Henry were quietly married at Oatlands Palace. Lest the public think it was a tad distasteful to be married on the day Cromwell was bumped off, the marriage wasn't made public until the 8th of August, however. A debate remains over what Catherine actually looked like. There are few full descriptions of her features, and no known contemporary portrait actually exists. Of those that have been put forward over the centuries, many are now positively identified as more likely sitters, and only a few remain with any possibility of being Catherine. There's no evidence she even had her portrait painted, and if she did, it would likely have been destroyed after her death the way images of Anne Boleyn were. The most famous image of her is a Holbein miniature dated to 1540, but a good argument has also been put forward that this is actually another painting of Anne of Cleves, who was of course also married in the same year to Henry. The two images do actually seem to show someone very similar in looks. The most likely portrait of Catherine might be Holbein's Portrait of a Young Woman. The sitter is unique in not being identified in any other portrait. It matches the little we know of Catherine's appearance and shows a young lady in an extremely wealthy and luxurious outfit with a French hood. The Latin inscription on the portrait also suggests the sitter is aged 17, roughly the most likely age of Catherine when she married Henry. As for Catherine herself, she wasn't exactly making a lot of friends at court, despite her kind-heartedness. The besotted king was happy to indulge her every whim and desire, and having endless amounts of jewels and clothing thrown her way meant Catherine got a bit greedy, wanting something different and new almost every day. This behaviour disgusted many at court, who thought a queen should, despite needing to maintain a regal status in high fashions and jewellery, not actually show that she wanted these things. Princess Mary also didn't like Catherine. Although she came from a Catholic family, she was a stepmother 9 years younger than her stepdaughter, and she soon showed that she was an empty-headed girl who loved nothing more than dancing and new clothes. While these aren't inherently bad traits, she and the well-educated, deeply religious and studious Mary were never going to click well together. None of this seems to have bothered Henry. As Catherine had grown up impoverished, neglected in every way possible, and had found company only with household servants, her newfound wealth, power and attendance went to her head a little bit. But she wasn't as arrogant about her position as Anne Boleyn had been, and Catherine was happy to use her place as queen to help others when they petitioned her. The problem was she was woefully unprepared for the backstabbing and manipulation of court, and Catherine never seemed to notice when she could be perilously close to being involved in intrigues. All Henry asked of his new young wife was that she give him a son, but despite visiting her chambers almost every night, Catherine never conceived a child during their short marriage. It would seem, with his increasing weight and advancing years, that Anne Boleyn's accusations during her trial of Henry's infertility were likely very true. As with Jane Seymour and Anne of Cleves, no plans were made for Catherine's coronation, probably only to happen once the country had a new prince. She was also too young to take part in any administrative matters of running the country. The court was rearranged, with more of the Howard family taking places in it, including in Catherine's own household, where several female members of her family became part of her entourage. At the New Year celebrations of 1541, Catherine and Henry were joined not only by Princess Mary, but also by Anne of Cleves. Although Mary and Catherine's relationship was somewhat stilted, Anne got on well with both of them. Even after Henry had gone to bed, Anne stayed up to enjoy the revelry, dancing with Catherine, and the next day, Catherine generously passed her gifts from the king on to Anne. But the king's good mood, which had started when he married his pretty young wife, soon grew worse over the winter as his leg began to bother him. In agonizing pain, trapped in a failing body, Henry refused to be seen by the members of his court and shut himself away in his chambers. Even dutiful Catherine was not allowed in to see Henry very often. She was left to preside over a half-empty court, and everyone worried that the king's general health and mood meant his death was imminent, especially as he appeared to be making things worse by drinking and eating too much. However, by Easter 1541, Henry's leg had improved, and he cheered up somewhat. It must have been a relief for Catherine, who had been unsure over what to do with the change in Henry. It was also around this time that Catherine once again showed her kind nature by looking out for the plight of 3 people. One was the Countess of Salisbury, Margaret Pole. She had been unfairly locked away in the Tower under suspicion of helping her son Reginald to overthrow Henry, and for 2 years the elderly lady had been left without proper clothes to keep her warm. Using her own money with the king's permission, Catherine ordered several garments for Margaret, some lined with fur, some made of luxurious fabrics to better her situation. Another 2 prisoners of the Tower also caught Catherine's attention, Sir Thomas Wyatt and Sir John Wallop, and she successfully petitioned Henry to release them both, although he did so grudgingly for Wyatt. Nonetheless, it was a popular move that looked good for both the king and queen. But once again, someone Catherine would rather not have known appeared in her life: Francis Derham. In August 1541, while Henry and Catherine were on progress, he appeared at court at Pontefract Castle. He had been recommended by Agnes, and the Queen worried that Francis would use his prior relationship to ruin her. She appointed Francis as her private secretary, but it was a very bad choice. He had a bad temper and regularly got into fights with other courtiers, and when once reprimanded for not rising when the Queen entered a council meeting, got into a brawl. And although he kept quiet when Henry was around, it was noted that Francis was far too familiar with Catherine, and this earned the jealousy of others who were attracted to her as well. She was easily flattered by male attention and did little to dissuade it. Added to this were rumours that she had once again started a relationship with Thomas Culpeper. But soon a series of events to Catherine's downfall would be set in motion. John Lascelles, a minor courtier, came forward with a shocking reveal. He approached the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, with information that Catherine had not been a virgin when she married the king. Lascelles' sister, Mary Hall, had been a serving girl in the Duchess of Norfolk's household, and John had suggested she ask for a position in the new Queen's staff once again. Mary refused, saying how she had seen Catherine's light ways and that she had personally witnessed her sexual escapades. While having sex before marriage wasn't actually a crime, it was frowned upon, and doubly so for a woman who became Queen of England. On top of this, to 16th century folk, it suggested a woman whose morals were loose enough that she might seek out an affair after marriage. Cranmer had to tread carefully though. Whereas Anne Boleyn had been in a similar position of being accused of adultery, Henry had wanted her gone. But he was madly in love with Catherine, and would likely not take kindly to any suggestion of her wrongdoing. However, for Cranmer, here was an opportunity to take down the entire Howard faction. He first called forward Mary Hall and asked for what she knew. She told him all about Henry Manox and how he had led Catherine on, and all about Francis Derham and the rumoured common law marriage between them. Mary firmly answered that the noises coming from the bed shared by Catherine and Francis had left little doubt in the minds of the women sharing the room with them as to what was happening in the bed. On the 30th of October, when the King and Queen came to Hampton Court, Cranmer decided to slip Henry a letter about what he had learned while the King prayed in his chapel. Cranmer had agonised over revealing what he knew, and when Henry read the letter and demanded to be told in person, Cranmer said he had sent the information in a letter as he hadn't had the heart to say it in person. Henry was stunned at the accusations, but he asked the Archbishop to get to the bottom of the matter. He then gave orders that Catherine was to be confined to her quarters with only Jane Boleyn in attendance. Henry also stated he would not yet go to see her, but in fact he would never see her in person again. She was dancing with her ladies at the time and they were sent away. Catherine's guilty conscience meant she didn't eat properly for 2 days, but actually at this point the king still believed in her innocence. John Lascelles was questioned again and repeated the same information. Then Cranmer found out about the fact Catherine had employed Francis Derham into her service, and the whole thing looked very sketchy. He reported to Henry, "She has betrayed you in thought, and if she had an opportunity, would have betrayed you in deed." While there wasn't actually any evidence yet of Catherine's wrongdoing, both Cranmer and Henry had jumped to the same conclusion, that she had committed adultery. And the king broke down and wept in front of his council that night. Henry would never recover his vivacity for life from this point onwards, his ego permanently bruised by the idea, and he left for Oatlands Palace to spend a few days away from the public eye. When Catherine knew Henry was leaving, she attempted to run past her guards to get to the king while he was at prayer in the Chapel Royal, but she was dragged back screaming and begging by her guards to her rooms. She knew if she could see Henry in person, there was a good chance of being forgiven, and Henry knew it too, keeping himself out of the way as he knew he would relent. All of her relatives had pretty much washed their hands of her and found excuses to be as far as possible from Catherine, and only her uncle Thomas Howard stayed near her at this time. He was with her when she was told the news and told how she was refusing to eat or drink and that she wept like a madwoman, and also that any implement with which Catherine might hasten her own death had been taken away. She knew what her likely end was, and someone else also suspected she would not end well, Jane Boleyn. As one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, she had been aiding the Queen in certain as yet unknown matters, and she knew she was in danger. Her behaviour was said to turn into raving madness. The Duchess of Norfolk started to turn over her properties for any signs of incriminating evidence to prevent her entire family sliding into disrepute, although she took the view that Catherine could hardly be punished for sex before marrying Henry, however distasteful it was to the 16th century public. Cranmer then visited Catherine on the 6th and 7th of November to question her, attempting to calm her frenzied panic with a paternal and firm manner, although initially he also intended to frighten her into giving a confession by stressing the importance of the law in this matter. As it turned out, it was impossible to get a rational conversation out of the poor frightened girl, and instead Cranmer handed her a letter from Henry, promising mercy if she answered all questions truthfully. It was a promise which would later be broken. Catherine confessed that there had been a relationship between herself and Francis, but that there had been no common law contract of some kind between them. But as Cranmer was leaving on the first night, Catherine called him back, saying she wished to change her statement, instead insisting that Francis had in fact raped her. Cranmer thought she was lying by her sudden change in statement after being left to think about it for a while, and it made him suspicious of what else Catherine might be lying about. But most importantly, Catherine denying any contract between herself and Francis meant instead of simply having her marriage annulled and being banned from court, she was making it a lot more complicated. She also replied that the only contact she had with Francis after leaving for court and prior to him entering her household was when he had written to inquire about the rumours of her marriage to Thomas Culpeper. This was a huge mistake, because now Culpeper entered the equation. Culpeper was arrested, the evidence was sent to Henry, including the additional part that Francis had raped Catherine, and some members of the council helped Catherine draft a plea to send to the king. Cranmer also personally informed the king that, in his opinion, there had in fact been a pre-contract between Catherine and Francis. Henry was cheered by this news. His wife hadn't in fact been unfaithful, and although it was possible the marriage would have to be annulled, at least he wouldn't have to execute another one, right? Cranmer needed more time to find evidence of Catherine's adultery, and he knew that the chances of Henry making things up with Catherine were high if he met up with her again. So it was suggested she be sent to Sion Abbey away from Hampton Court, and the king agreed. Jane Boleyn, however, was sent to the Tower to await questioning. Henry offered up all the evidence so far to Parliament, hoping to enact their disgust and also leaving out any information about a possible pre-contract, appearing to want a divorce. All parties involved were arrested and questioned as well, starting with Manox, who admitted to attempting to seduce Catherine, but getting nowhere with her. Having committed no crime, he was released by the council. Catherine Tilney, a chamberer of Catherine's, was questioned next. Tilney remembered having gone upstairs with her lady to Jane Boleyn's quarters, but then that she had waited outside with Boleyn's own maid and that the Queen had remained in there for several hours late into the night, on more than one occasion. Tilney was certain Catherine had been meeting with someone in Boleyn's rooms, but she did not know who. She also reported having to pass strange messages to Jane. Another of Catherine's staff, Margaret Morton, claimed that the Queen had grown angry with herself and another attendant at Pontefract Castle, refusing them entry to her bedroom. Margaret felt it was to keep them out for some sinister reason. And both women also testified that Jane had taken letters between Catherine and an unknown party, who at this point was supposed to be Francis. But it began to dawn on the council that Culpeper might actually be the object of Catherine's affections, and Morton confirmed this when she said she had caught the Queen lovingly looking out of a window at him. Which, to be fair, has to be the world's flimsiest evidence, even if it was true. It did also turn out, however, that the Queen and Culpeper had once been left alone in her room for 5 or 6 hours, and that Morton was sure they had had sex. The council searched through Culpeper's belongings and turned up a love letter from Catherine to him, saying how much she missed not being with him at times, and ending the letter, "Yours as long as life endures." It was pretty damning evidence. Jane Boleyn was finally questioned next. Knowing the penalty for helping a queen to commit adultery and fearing for her life, she admitted to suspecting Catherine of having slept with Thomas Culpeper. She stated that from all the noises she had heard them making together when meeting in her chambers, it could be little else. Jane herself had stood guard and one night had to tell Culpeper to flee quickly, for Henry had unexpectedly come to see his wife. Jane was sent back to the Tower after her testimony and finally sank into deep and not unexpected madness. Culpeper was next. Seeing little point in lying now, he admitted that he had indeed pursued his cousin Catherine, but that at first she had rebuffed him. In the spring of 1541, when the king had been depressed and left Catherine to her own devices, she had finally allowed Culpeper's advances. Culpeper stated that before long Catherine was dying of love for him and had called him her sweet little fool. Both of them knew it was a dangerous game they were playing, and Catherine had often fretted over being discovered. He also confirmed what Jane had said, that he had met Catherine in secret in Jane's rooms and that Jane had kept watch for them. However, despite what everyone suspected, Culpeper denied he and Catherine had actually had sex, saying that although he had wanted to seduce the Queen, she had refused him this final act. Whether this was true or merely a final act of gallantry on Culpeper's side, we will never really know. Cranmer and other council members again went to visit Catherine, hoping to bully or coerce a confession of adultery out of her, despite Culpeper denying they had laid together. But even under the most strenuous questioning, Catherine still vehemently held to her story, repeating that despite her feelings for Culpeper, she had not slept with him. Again, maybe this was true, but weighing it up with the rest of the evidence, Catherine was probably lying to try and save herself and Culpeper, which, to be fair, no one could blame her for. Stripped of all jewels and finery before going to Sion Abbey, she was also forced to hand over a ring Henry had given her that had once graced the finger of Anne of Cleves. It was a physical symbol of her queenship being removed. Culpeper and Derham were both found guilty of high treason, and on the 10th of December 1541 at Tyburn, Culpeper was beheaded and Derham faced the grisly end of being hanged, drawn and quartered. Their heads were put upon pikes along London Bridge. Many of Catherine's Howard relatives were also flung into the Tower, although many managed to make their way out again. No actual solid evidence had been found for Catherine's misconduct, however, and so Parliament retroactively brought in a law which made it illegal for a Queen Consort to fail to disclose her sexual past to the King within 20 days of their marriage, or to incite someone to commit adultery with her. Catherine was charged with this new and ridiculous law and sentenced to death. There was no formal trial. When council members came to take her to the Tower by barge, she screamed and panicked, trying to get away as they manhandled her onto the boat. She was led through Traitor's Gate and her execution was planned for the 13th of February. The night before her imminent death, Catherine apparently asked for the block she would be laying her head on, practicing with it over and over and over. It's obvious her mood had sunk as low as possible, and there was nothing left for the poor young girl to think about but her execution. She had been abandoned by all members of her family, the Duke of Norfolk especially making himself supplicant to Henry and damning his niece in far more vicious words than anyone else used. And few publicly seemed sympathetic to her plight, although in private they may have felt differently. On the 13th, Catherine was led to Tower Green along with Jane Boleyn. Catherine looked pale and distraught, but walked calmly to the scaffold with some assistance. She asked the crowd to pray for herself and the king, and also to look to her as an example of how not to live their lives, but to obey the king in all respects. Moments later, the axe came down and cut off her head with a single stroke. Jane Boleyn followed just shortly afterwards, as Catherine's body was still being wrapped in black cloth by her sobbing attendants. Henry had even had a special act passed to allow him to execute people afflicted with insanity, something that had previously not been allowed, just in order to get rid of Jane. She recovered herself enough to give a short speech before following Catherine to the same fate. Catherine's remains were taken to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula and laid to rest near those of Anne Boleyn. Henry seemed broken by what had happened, and it would be another 18 months before he would consider remarrying to the woman who would be his final wife, Catherine Parr. Little Princess Elizabeth, who had reportedly liked Katherine Howard, was deeply affected by her death. Upon hearing of it, she declared then and there that she would never marry. Promise she never broke, so scarred was she by her father's actions. Katherine Howard never really had a chance to leave much of a legacy, dying while still in her youth, and she certainly didn't leave any good example for those who followed, except perhaps in how not to anger a murderous tyrant monarch. It cannot be denied that she made a lot of stupid choices regarding men and her life with Henry, and Catherine also knowingly at least had an emotional affair that she knew would end badly. But she was also just a young teenager, full of hormones like any other, but without the warm and comforting moral compass of a parent or carer to steer her in the right direction. Devoid of love and attention, Catherine sought it out in unhealthy ways, and when she finally had a husband, who, despite his age and infirmities, was happy to grant her every whim, she still couldn't help herself when someone else gave her that attention during the king's low mood. The legacy of Catherine's story is a tragic one, a reminder of how brutal life could be in the 16th century and how brutal life could be under the wrong monarch, and especially as a woman. She was probably a typical teenager, but due to her nobility, her upbringing, and her neglect, Catherine was in the spotlight in a way that amplified what she had done. Had she been born a country peasant, her liaisons would probably have been largely overlooked. Her story is also a reminder of how a young person could end up with no guidance, love, affection, or care given to them, and the person they might become. To this day, there is a story that her screaming spirit can be found at Hampton Court, begging and weeping for Henry's mercy as she is dragged back to her chambers. Mercy that never came. Of all Henry's wives, Katherine Howard is the one least likely to be resting peacefully. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.